In the years preceding the attack on Pearl Harbor, the relationship between the United States and Britain underwent a profound transformation that would reshape global politics and define the course of World War II. Although the United States publicly embraced a policy of neutrality at the outbreak of the war in 1939, its commitment to democratic ideals, strategic calculations, and mounting concerns about the unchecked aggression of the Axis powers gradually drew the nation closer to Britain. The American people, still scarred by the collective memory of the First World War and shaken by the economic devastation of the Great Depression, were deeply divided over the prospect of another foreign entanglement. Isolationists, bolstered by powerful political organizations such as the America First Committee, insisted that European conflicts should not dictate American destiny, and argued vehemently that involvement in overseas warfare would result in economic hardship, loss of American lives, and the abandonment of the nation's long-standing tradition of non-intervention. Yet even as the debate raged domestically, international developments challenged the feasibility of remaining uninvolved. Germany's sweeping conquests across Europe, the collapse of France, and the relentless bombardment of Britain during the Blitz underscored the severity of the threat posed by totalitarian regimes. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized earlier than most that the fall of Britain would not merely be a European tragedy, it would irrevocably alter the balance of power and leave the United States vulnerable in a world dominated by authoritarian empires. Convinced that American security was inseparable from the survival of democratic nations abroad, Roosevelt adopted a policy of non-belligerent support, gradually steering the United States from strict neutrality toward active but unofficial partnership with Britain. This shift unfolded through a series of layered, often controversial measures, each representing a step closer to engagement. Diplomatic cooperation expanded as the two nations forged a shared strategic vision, culminating in important agreements that set the tone for future Allied unity. Economic ties deepened dramatically, most notably through the Lend-Lease program, which transformed the United States into the arsenal of democracy by providing Britain with weapons, supplies, and financial assistance essential for its survival. Military cooperation intensified as U.S. naval patrols began defending Atlantic shipping routes from German U-boats, leading to several armed confrontations long before war was officially declared. Intelligence sharing, joint planning, and technological collaboration further linked the destinies of the two nations, laying the groundwork for what would ultimately become the most powerful military alliance in history. Meanwhile, events in the Pacific complicated America's position as tensions with Japan escalated over territorial ambitions and trade embargoes, forcing American leaders to consider the possibility of a two-front conflict. Despite efforts to maintain peace, diplomatic negotiations with Japan deteriorated, setting the stage for the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. That moment shocked the nation into unity and erased years of political debate, thrusting the United States fully into the global struggle against the Axis. Yet America's entry into the war did not begin in a vacuum. It was the culmination of a long and complex process in which political ideals, strategic imperatives, global realities, and moral considerations converged. The support provided to Britain before Pearl Harbor was not merely a prelude to war, but a pivotal phase that revealed the tensions between isolationism and internationalism, shaped American identity, and redefined the nation's role on the world stage. It demonstrated how a democratic society wrestles with existential threats, how leaders navigate public opinion during times of crisis, and how a nation balances its principles with its interests. The story of America's support for Britain is therefore more than a historical episode. It is a lens through which we can understand the evolution of modern American foreign policy, the birth of the U.S.-British special relationship, and the enduring question of when and why the United States chooses to act in the defense of global stability. Exploring this period illuminates not only the political calculations and diplomatic maneuvers of governments, but also the broader forces that shape national destiny, including the power of ideals, the weight of public sentiment, the unpredictability of global conflict, and the responsibilities that come with great power. It is in this turbulent and transformative era that the United States began its transition from a nation guardedly watching events overseas to one prepared to assume a central role in world affairs, a shift made possible in no small part through its steady, deliberate, and ultimately decisive support for Britain before the fateful day at Pearl Harbor. In the aftermath of the First World War, the United States entered a period of profound reflection and disillusionment that shaped its attitudes toward international engagement for decades to come. American soldiers had fought and died in what was promised to be the war to end all wars, yet the resulting Treaty of Versailles failed to deliver a stable peace. Many citizens felt that the nation had been drawn into a distant conflict under misleading pretenses, manipulated by economic interests and foreign alliances. As images of the war's destruction circulated and returning veterans shared their traumatic experiences, a powerful determination began to take hold. The country should avoid any entanglements that might drag it back into another European catastrophe. This sentiment became a central element of American political identity during the 1920s and 1930s. The desire to stay removed from old-world rivalries was not simply an abstract ideal, but a deeply emotional conviction rooted in grief, frustration, and a fundamental mistrust of European diplomacy. As fascist regimes rose in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere, many Americans acknowledged the troubling developments but remained convinced that distance and neutrality would shield the nation from the turmoil abroad. This belief, however, would soon be tested as tensions overseas escalated and the international order began to unravel under the pressures of totalitarian expansion. Throughout the 1930s, the Great Depression further intensified the nation's inward focus, reinforcing the belief that domestic recovery must take precedence over foreign concerns. With unemployment soaring and widespread poverty gripping the country, Americans looked to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs to restore stability and hope. This economic crisis fostered a political environment in which foreign entanglements seemed both impractical and morally questionable. Large segments of the population argued that scarce national resources should be invested in rebuilding American lives rather than aiding distant nations. In this atmosphere, Roosevelt himself approached international affairs cautiously, aware that even modest steps toward engagement could provoke public backlash. Despite his growing concerns about events in Europe, he prioritized domestic reform in the early years of his presidency. Meanwhile, developments abroad continued to grow more alarming. Adolf Hitler's rapid consolidation of power, the remilitarization of Germany, and the systematic dismantling of the post-World War I order signaled the emergence of a threat that could not easily be ignored. Yet many Americans still regarded these events as remote and unlikely to affect them directly. The Atlantic Ocean seemed to provide a natural barrier, and the traditions of non-involvement in European power struggles reinforced a sense of false security. Isolationism solidified during this period not merely as a political stance, but as a cultural movement sustained by diverse groups across the country. Pacifists, conservative rural communities, progressive reformers, labor activists, and veterans of World War I all found common ground in their insistence that America must not repeat what they saw as the tragic mistakes of the previous generation. Influential organizations, including the America First Committee, mobilized millions through newspapers, rallies, and radio broadcasts. They warned that intervention in European affairs would sacrifice American lives for causes that did not serve national interests. Many Americans viewed internationalism with suspicion, believing that financial and political elites had manipulated the country into World War I. Literature, films, and commentary of the time often echoed this sentiment, portraying war as a futile enterprise driven by greed and diplomatic arrogance. Even those who sympathized with the victims of fascist aggression remained skeptical that the United States could or should play a decisive role in addressing the crisis. This widespread distrust of foreign involvement made it politically hazardous for Roosevelt to advocate openly for stronger support of European democracies, despite his growing recognition that the global balance of power was shifting in dangerous ways. Although Franklin D. Roosevelt publicly respected the nation's desire for neutrality, he privately harbored deep concerns about the expansionist ambitions of fascist regimes. His experience as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I had shown him the costs of delayed action in the face of rising authoritarianism. As Germany marched into the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and dismembered Czechoslovakia, Roosevelt recognized a pattern that threatened not only European stability, but the broader international system. Nevertheless, he understood that acting too boldly could alienate voters and jeopardize his ability to address both domestic and foreign challenges. His strategy, therefore, relied on subtle persuasion. He used speeches to highlight the value of democratic institutions, the fragility of peace, and the importance of preparedness without explicitly advocating intervention. Roosevelt's mastery of communication became crucial as he attempted to reshape public opinion gradually. Through fireside chats and press conferences, he encouraged Americans to consider the possibility that neutrality alone might not guarantee safety in an increasingly interconnected world. His rhetoric framed global events not as distant conflicts, but as part of a broader struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, an argument that would later justify more assertive policies. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked a turning point in the global crisis. Britain and France declared war on Germany, and World War II officially began. In the United States, the news shocked the population but did not immediately alter public opposition to involvement. Instead, Americans largely reaffirmed their commitment to staying out of the conflict. Yet policymakers recognized that strict neutrality posed practical challenges. Existing neutrality acts prohibited arms sales and loans to belligerent nations, potentially placing democratic allies at a disadvantage. After intense debate, Congress agreed to modify the law by adopting a cash and carry provision, permitting nations at war to purchase American goods if they paid up front and transported them independently. This amendment maintained the appearance of neutrality while offering significant, though limited, assistance to Britain and France. Its passage demonstrated that public opinion, while still deeply weary of military involvement, was beginning to accept the idea of supporting the Allies under controlled conditions. The cash and carry system soon became a crucial means of strengthening Britain's ability to resist German aggression during the early years of the war. As the conflict in Europe intensified, the United States faced renewed debates about the meaning and limits of neutrality. Isolationists argued that even economic support for Britain and France would entangle the nation in the war. They believed that financial and material ties formed during World War I had contributed to America's eventual entry into combat and feared repeating this pattern. Interventionists, however, contended that supporting democratic allies was essential for preventing totalitarian domination of Europe. They warned that a Nazi-controlled continent would ultimately threaten American security, both militarily and economically. These competing visions shaped the national conversation as the war expanded. Newspapers, political leaders, and civic organizations took sides, producing a complex and often polarized debate. Roosevelt continued to steer a careful course between these factions, advocating expanded defense spending, increased production of war materials, and heightened vigilance without directly calling for intervention. The nation found itself in a precarious position, committed to neutrality, yet increasingly aware that events abroad could have profound implications at home. As the 1930s progressed and the global situation deteriorated, the United States found itself struggling to balance its long-standing commitment to neutrality with the increasing urgency of European events. The initial Neutrality Acts, passed between 1935 and 1937, were constructed under the assumption that rigid restrictions on American trade, loans, and travel would prevent the chain of circumstances that had led the country into the First World War. These laws reflected deep public disillusionment with the earlier conflict, and a widespread belief that economic entanglements with belligerent nations had forced the United States into war against its will. Legislators hoped that by limiting the nation's exposure to foreign conflicts, they could effectively insulate the American people from global instability. Yet, as Adolf Hitler expanded his reach and military aggression became more blatant, policymakers began to recognize that the rigid framework of the Neutrality Acts might unintentionally favor aggressor nations while hindering democratic states in need of assistance. The original Neutrality Acts imposed sweeping prohibitions. The U.S. government was barred from exporting arms to nations at war, American ships were forbidden from entering conflict zones, and loans or credit to belligerents were strictly banned. While these measures were intended to prevent military involvement, they had the unintended effect of placing all nations, regardless of whether they were aggressors or victims, on the same legal footing. For European democracies, such as Britain and France, the laws were particularly burdensome. As Germany intensified its rearmament and pursued territorial expansion, the Allies found themselves at a distinct disadvantage. They relied heavily on access to American industrial output, which had become one of the most advanced in the world. However, under the Neutrality Acts, purchasing essential materials was nearly impossible. This imbalance raised ethical and strategic concerns in Washington, prompting debates about whether neutrality, when applied rigidly, could actually undermine global stability rather than protect it. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized these limitations early in his presidency, though he was cautious about challenging the prevailing isolationist mood. Public opinion in the United States remained firmly opposed to military engagement, and Congress reflected that sentiment. Many lawmakers believed that even minor adjustments to neutrality might lead the nation down a slippery slope toward entanglement. Roosevelt therefore approached the issue with deliberate subtlety, framing revisions to the Neutrality Acts as necessary adjustments rather than fundamental changes. He argued that neutrality should be flexible enough to protect American interests while upholding moral responsibility in the face of authoritarian aggression. This approach allowed him to gradually build political support for what would later become a significant reorientation of American foreign policy. Events in Europe accelerated the need for change. Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, shattered any remaining illusions of stability on the continent. Britain and France quickly declared war, marking the official beginning of the Second World War. The rapid escalation highlighted the inadequacies of the existing neutrality framework. Roosevelt moved quickly to request revisions to the Neutrality Acts, seeking to permit the sale of arms under conditions that would minimize risks to American security. After contentious debate, Congress approved the cash-and-carry provision, allowing belligerent nations to purchase arms and supplies from the United States, as long as they paid in cash and transported the goods themselves. This approach maintained the legal appearance of neutrality, while providing much-needed assistance to Britain and France, who maintained control of the seas and thus could safely transport materials. The cash-and-carry system fundamentally altered the dynamics of American involvement, even though it was framed as a continuation of neutrality. For Britain and France, it offered a lifeline at a moment of escalating danger. Their domestic industries could not fully match the scale of German rearmament, and the ability to purchase American planes, artillery, and industrial supplies provided a crucial advantage. The requirement for immediate payment ensured that the United States avoided the entangling debts that had created tension after World War I. And the mandate that Allied ships transport goods prevented American vessels from entering conflict zones. Politically, these safeguards reassured the public that the administration was not risking American lives or economic stability. Strategically, however, the policy marked a clear alignment with the Allied cause. Isolationists were quick to criticize the new policy, arguing that cash and carry was merely a disguised step toward intervention. Groups such as the America First Committee accused Roosevelt of manipulating the law to favor Britain and France while undermining the principle of true neutrality. They argued that economic support would inevitably lead to deeper commitments, and warned that Germany might view the policy as a hostile act. Isolationist leaders emphasized that the Atlantic still protected the nation and insisted that involvement in Europe's war would be disastrous. These critics dominated public rallies, published editorials, and mobilized supporters to pressure Congress. Yet, despite their efforts, the urgency of the European situation and Roosevelt's persuasive framing helped maintain public support for the policy. Interventionists, by contrast, celebrated the cash-and-carry policy as a necessary corrective to rigid neutrality. They argued that the United States had a moral obligation to assist democratic nations standing against fascist aggression. Editorials in major newspapers emphasized the dangers of allowing Germany to overpower Europe, warning that American security would be threatened if the Allies collapsed. Business leaders also recognized the advantages of the policy. Arms manufacturers, industrial corporations, and agricultural producers saw the opportunity to boost production at a time when the domestic economy was still recovering from the Great Depression. Increased demand for American goods stimulated employment and contributed to renewed industrial expansion. The early months of cash and carry demonstrated the logistical and political complexities of aiding belligerent nations under the banner of neutrality. Britain quickly emerged as the primary beneficiary, using its naval superiority to transport vast quantities of American materials. French purchases were more limited due to the rapid deterioration of their military situation in early 1940. Meanwhile, German leaders condemned the policy, accusing the United States of abandoning neutrality despite legal safeguards. German propaganda portrayed the policy as proof of American hostility, though Germany's government was constrained in its response due to fears of provoking premature U.S. involvement. As the war continued, it became clear that cash and carry was only a temporary solution to a growing crisis. Britain's financial resources were rapidly diminishing as the scale of the conflict expanded. The costs of purchasing American arms, maintaining the Royal Navy, and sustaining wartime production strained the nation's economy to the breaking point. By late 1940, British leaders warned Roosevelt that they were running out of cash and that without additional support, they would be unable to continue purchasing American materials. This revelation underscored the limitations of the policy and paved the way for more ambitious measures. As 1940 drew to a close, the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. Germany's rapid conquest of Western Europe left Britain standing alone against the Axis powers, its economic and military resources stretched to the breaking point. The fall of France shocked policymakers in Washington, reinforcing fears that a German-dominated Europe would pose a grave threat to global security. American officials increasingly recognized that Britain's survival was essential not only for European stability but for the defense of the Western Hemisphere itself. Yet Britain found itself unable to continue purchasing American arms and supplies under the cash and carry policy. Its gold reserves and dollar assets were nearly exhausted, and the strain of maintaining a global navy and supporting wartime production threatened national bankruptcy. These developments forced the United States to confront a crucial question: how could it support Britain without directly entering the war? President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded by proposing a revolutionary new system of aid, one that would bypass the financial limitations of cash and carry while maintaining America's official neutrality. The Lend-Lease proposal, introduced to Congress in early 1941, suggested that the United States should supply Britain and other allied nations with arms, food, and equipment on terms similar to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. The analogy, which Roosevelt famously used in a press conference, emphasized practicality and moral obligation rather than financial transaction. Instead of requiring upfront payments, the United States would lend or lease materials deemed essential to the defense of America and its allies. In practice, this meant that the United States could provide unlimited support without expecting immediate repayment. The proposal represented a profound shift in American foreign policy, signaling a willingness to assume a major role in the global struggle against Axis aggression. The debate over Lend-Lease was intense and polarized. Supporters argued that aiding Britain was critical to preventing German domination of Europe, which would leave the United States isolated in a world controlled by hostile powers. Roosevelt maintained that the policy was not only an act of moral responsibility, but a strategic necessity, asserting that helping Britain fight the war would keep American soldiers out of direct combat. Interventionist groups, including the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, mobilized public opinion by highlighting the dangers of inaction. Newspaper editorials, radio broadcasts, and political speeches framed Lend-Lease as the logical next step in escalating American support short of war. They emphasized that the economic and industrial power of the United States was unmatched, and that failure to use this power in defense of democracy would be both morally wrong and strategically disastrous. Isolationists, however, condemned Lend-Lease as an unprecedented expansion of executive authority and a direct threat to American neutrality. The America First Committee argued that providing unlimited aid would entangle the nation in the European conflict and inevitably draw the United States into war. Critics warned that Roosevelt's analogy of lending a garden hose masked a deeper truth, that Lend-Lease could commit the United States to vast, unregulated expenditures with no guarantee of repayment. Congressional opponents expressed concern that the bill granted Roosevelt sweeping powers to transfer materials, allocate industrial output, and negotiate agreements without adequate oversight. Many isolationists believed that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans continued to provide sufficient protection, and that entering the conflict would result in enormous loss of American lives. These arguments shaped a contentious national debate, with passionate speeches delivered in Congress and across the country. Despite vigorous opposition, Lend-Lease ultimately passed in March 1941. The legislation granted the president remarkable authority to supply defense materials to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Once enacted, the policy fundamentally transformed America's role in the global conflict. The United States, while officially neutral, became the primary supplier of weapons, food, vehicles, aircraft, and raw materials for Britain and other allied nations. American factories began operating at unprecedented levels of production, fueling a wartime industrial boom that revitalized the domestic economy. Millions of American workers found employment in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines, marking the beginning of a broader mobilization that would later support direct American involvement in the war. Lend-Lease was not merely an economic policy. It redefined the relationship between the United States and Britain. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill hailed the legislation as the most significant act of American assistance since the beginning of the war. He understood that without Lend-Lease, Britain would be unable to continue fighting. The policy alleviated the immediate financial burden on Britain and allowed it to acquire desperately needed materials, from aircraft engines to food supplies. Convoys carrying American goods began crossing the Atlantic in increasing quantities, sustaining Britain throughout the Blitz and maintaining essential military operations. The program extended beyond weapons and ammunition. The United States supplied medical equipment, clothing, agricultural products, and even industrial machinery necessary for wartime manufacturing. The economic and logistical challenges of the Lend-Lease program were immense. Coordinating the production, shipment, and allocation of materials required unprecedented cooperation between government agencies, private industries, and allied military planners. American factories had to produce equipment not only for British forces, but for domestic defense needs, requiring rapid expansion and technological innovation. This surge in production contributed to a major economic transformation, ending the last remnants of the Great Depression. Industrial centers across the country experienced rapid growth as workers from diverse backgrounds joined the wartime labor force. Women increasingly entered manufacturing roles, building aircraft, tanks, and naval vessels. Lend-Lease thus accelerated the social and economic changes that would define America's wartime mobilization. As the program expanded, its scope widened to include other nations resisting Axis aggression. The Soviet Union, following Germany's invasion in June 1941, became a major recipient of American aid. Despite ideological differences, Roosevelt argued that aiding the Soviets was necessary to prevent Germany from consolidating control over Europe. Massive quantities of American trucks, locomotives, food supplies, and military equipment flowed to the Eastern Front, bolstering the Soviet war effort. China also received Lend-Lease support in its struggle against Japanese expansion. The global reach of the program underscored the United States' evolving role as the cornerstone of Allied logistics and the supplier of resources that sustained multiple theaters of war simultaneously. The strategic impact of Lend-Lease was profound. By ensuring that Britain and other Allied nations could continue fighting, the program prevented the Axis powers from achieving swift victories in Europe and Asia. It bought invaluable time for American rearmament and strengthened diplomatic ties among Allied nations. For Britain, Lend-Lease ensured continuity in military operations and supported its civilian population through some of the darkest moments of the war. For the Soviet Union, American trucks and logistical support played a critical role in maintaining mobility on the Eastern Front. For America, the program laid the foundation for full-scale wartime mobilization, preparing the nation economically and strategically for the conflict that loomed on the horizon. As 1941 progressed, the United States found itself increasingly drawn into the global conflict through a series of incremental steps that blurred the line between neutrality and active partnership. Although the country had not yet declared war, its military and naval cooperation with Britain expanded rapidly, reflecting both strategic necessity and ideological commitment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that Britain's survival was critical to preventing German domination of Europe and safeguarding the Atlantic. American officials recognized that oceans no longer guaranteed immunity from foreign threats, especially as German submarines extended their reach. With these considerations in mind, the Roosevelt administration began implementing measures designed to strengthen Britain's defenses while preparing the United States for the likelihood of future conflict. These moves were carefully calibrated to maintain the appearance of neutrality, yet their strategic implications were unmistakable. The United States was becoming an informal ally of Britain even before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. One of the earliest and most consequential forms of cooperation involved intelligence sharing. Prior to the United States' formal entry into the war, American and British intelligence agencies began exchanging sensitive information related to German activities, encrypted communications, and naval operations. This collaboration laid the groundwork for what would later become one of the most successful intelligence partnerships in history. The British shared their breakthroughs in code breaking, including early insights into German Enigma communications. In return, the United States provided valuable data derived from its expanding radio intercept and cryptographic operations. This exchange was mutually beneficial, enhancing the Allies' ability to track German naval movements and assess strategic threats. Although such cooperation remained secret from the general public, it marked a profound deepening of U.S.-British ties and demonstrated America's growing commitment to the Allied cause. Military cooperation extended beyond intelligence. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September 1940 represented a significant step toward active involvement in the war. Under this deal, the United States transferred 50 aging but still serviceable destroyers to Britain in exchange for long-term leases on strategically located naval and air bases in the Western Hemisphere. These bases, spanning from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, strengthened America's defensive perimeter and enhanced its ability to patrol the Atlantic. For Britain, the destroyers provided much-needed support at a time when German U-boats were inflicting devastating losses on Allied shipping. The agreement symbolized a practical exchange of military assets, yet it also reflected a broader shift in U.S. policy. By transferring military hardware to a belligerent nation, all while securing strategic footholds, the United States demonstrated that it was willing to take calculated risks to support Britain's survival. Military cooperation extended into higher gear when German U-boats started mauling British shipping lifelines. Roosevelt authorized the U.S. Navy to patrol the Atlantic and relay the positions of German U-boats to British forces, a move that edged the United States ever closer to direct confrontation. These patrols, initially framed as defensive measures to protect the Western Hemisphere, effectively turned the Atlantic into a shared operational space between the American and British navies. American warships shadowed convoys, monitored submarine activity, and reported intelligence to British commanders. As patrol boundaries expanded eastward, the likelihood of hostile encounters with German vessels increased. Although the United States technically remained neutral, its naval operations strongly favored the Allied cause, illustrating a form of undeclared cooperation that tested the limits of neutrality and strained diplomatic relations with Germany. In mid-1941, the United States took another bold step by extending military protection into the North Atlantic. In July, American forces assumed responsibility for defending Iceland, a strategically critical island previously controlled by Britain. This move ensured that British troops stationed there could be redeployed to other fronts, while placing American forces at a vital midpoint in the Atlantic supply route. The occupation of Iceland was justified as a defensive action necessary to protect the hemisphere from Axis expansion, yet it underscored America's willingness to take on direct strategic responsibilities previously handled by Britain. The deployment of American troops to Iceland marked one of the earliest instances of U.S. military forces assuming a frontline role in the conflict, even before an official declaration of war. As cooperative ventures increased, so too did tensions with Germany. U.S. naval patrols soon encountered German submarines in situations that led to hostile engagements. The most notable incident occurred in September 1941, when the USS Greer exchanged fire with a German U-boat. Although each side claimed the other had initiated the attack, the Greer incident provided Roosevelt with an opportunity to redefine America's naval posture. In a national address, he announced a shoot-on-sight policy against any Axis vessel threatening American or neutral shipping. This declaration represented a major escalation of U.S. involvement and effectively placed the country in a state of undeclared naval war with Germany. The policy marked the abandonment of strict neutrality in the Atlantic and signaled that the United States was now an active participant in protecting Allied supply routes. Subsequent incidents further heightened the sense of impending conflict. In October 1941, the USS Herne was torpedoed by a German submarine while escorting an Allied convoy, resulting in the deaths of several American sailors. The attack shocked the American public and intensified calls for stronger action against Germany. Just weeks later, the USS Reuben James was sunk while escorting a convoy to Britain, becoming the first American warship lost to enemy action during the conflict. The sinking claimed the lives of more than 100 American sailors, underscoring the deadly consequences of America's growing involvement in the Atlantic. Roosevelt condemned the attacks as deliberate acts of aggression, arguing that Germany's actions proved the necessity of supporting Britain and confronting the Axis threat. These events reinforced the perception that war with Germany had become increasingly inevitable. The pattern of cooperation extended to air and ground forces as well. American military advisors worked closely with British officers to improve training, logistics, and strategic planning. Joint development of military technology, including radar and aircraft designs, accelerated as the two nations pooled their scientific and industrial capabilities. The expansion of airfields, research facilities, and training centers highlighted the growing integration of American and British military efforts. These projects reflected a shared understanding that technological superiority would be essential to countering the Axis powers. Even without formal alliance, the United States and Britain were functioning as partners, coordinating strategy and preparing for a conflict that both increasingly viewed as unavoidable. As 1941 drew to a close, the United States stood on the precipice of global conflict. Although it had not yet formally entered World War II, its political, economic, and military commitments increasingly signaled a nation moving toward unavoidable confrontation. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December would ultimately end any remaining illusions of neutrality, but the path to that moment was shaped by months, and indeed years, of escalating tensions, policy decisions, and strategic calculations. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced the difficult challenge of preparing the United States for war while navigating intense domestic divisions. Many Americans still hoped to avoid direct involvement, but growing Axis aggression made disengagement nearly impossible. By late 1941, the United States had adopted a posture that was defensive in name, but offensive in practice. A stance that reflected both geopolitical necessity and Roosevelt's belief that the Axis powers threatened the foundations of democratic civilization. One of the most significant developments on the road to war was the deepening global crisis caused by Axis expansion. In Europe, Germany's rapid conquests, from the fall of France to its invasion of the Soviet Union, demonstrated the escalating reach of Nazi power. In Asia, Japan's ongoing war in China and its growing ambitions in Southeast Asia threatened American strategic and economic interests. These dual threats forced U.S. policymakers to confront the reality that the world's balance of power was shifting in ways incompatible with American security. The United States depended on open trade routes, access to raw materials, and the survival of democratic allies. The Axis challenge to these interests could not be ignored. As Roosevelt watched Europe fall under authoritarian domination and Japan push aggressively across Asia, he understood that American intervention might eventually become necessary to preserve both U.S. national security and the international order. Roosevelt's policies during this period reflected a careful balancing act between public opinion and strategic demands. The president recognized that many Americans remained deeply wary of another overseas conflict, haunted by the memory of World War I. Isolationist groups, such as the America First Committee, continued to argue that U.S. involvement in foreign wars would bring economic ruin and unnecessary sacrifice. Yet Roosevelt also understood that if Britain fell, or Japan achieved dominance in Asia, the United States would face a far more dangerous world. To bridge this divide, the administration pursued a strategy of incremental engagement. Programs such as Lend-Lease allowed the United States to support Britain and other allied nations without committing troops to combat. Roosevelt framed these policies as vital to America's own defense, emphasizing that supplying weapons and resources to the Allies was far preferable to fighting the Axis alone later. This approach gradually shifted public opinion toward acceptance of greater involvement. A key turning point in U.S. foreign policy came with the Atlantic Charter, a joint declaration issued by Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August 1941. Although the United States was not yet officially at war, Roosevelt undertook the unprecedented step of meeting Churchill aboard naval vessels off the coast of Newfoundland. Together, they crafted a statement outlining their shared vision for a post-war world based on self-determination, collective security, and economic cooperation. The Atlantic Charter served not only as a moral statement of principles, but as a symbolic acknowledgement that the United States and Britain were linked in a common endeavor. By endorsing a future international order incompatible with Axis ambitions, the United States signaled a long-term commitment to opposing totalitarian aggression. The Charter also helped prepare the American public for the idea that the nation had a role to play in shaping global outcomes, even if that role meant eventual military intervention. As German submarines intensified their campaign in the Atlantic, the United States found itself increasingly drawn into direct confrontations. Incidents involving the USS Greer, USS Kearney, and USS Reuben James in the fall of 1941 underscored the dangers of America's expanding naval presence. Each encounter fueled debates at home over whether the United States had already crossed the line into undeclared war. Roosevelt used these incidents to bolster support for stronger measures, arguing that German aggression left the nation no choice but to defend itself and its interests. The public's reaction was mixed, but the series of attacks made it difficult to maintain the claim that America could remain safely neutral. By the end of 1941, U.S. naval forces were escorting Allied convoys and engaging in defensive actions that were increasingly indistinguishable from open warfare. This evolution reflected not only the pressures of global conflict, but also Roosevelt's determination to ensure Britain's survival at all costs. While tensions with Germany mounted, the situation in the Pacific deteriorated with alarming speed. Japan, facing economic strain from its prolonged conflict in China, sought to expand further into Southeast Asia. The United States, alarmed by these ambitions, imposed economic sanctions, including an embargo on vital oil shipments. These measures were intended to deter further Japanese expansion, but had the unintended effect of escalating tensions. Japan viewed the embargo as a direct threat to its strategic survival, prompting its leaders to consider bold military action. Diplomacy continued through most of 1941, but mutual distrust hindered meaningful progress. Japanese officials sought the removal of sanctions and recognition of their conquests. The United States insisted on a withdrawal from China and respect for international agreements. As negotiations faltered, the possibility of armed conflict grew. Both nations prepared for the worst, even as they publicly professed a desire for peace. Throughout these months of mounting tension, intelligence reports and diplomatic cables indicated that Japan might launch a surprise attack somewhere in the Pacific. U.S. military planners believed that the Philippines or British Malaya were likely targets, given their strategic importance. Few considered Hawaii the most probable site of an attack, despite scattered warnings. This miscalculation stemmed from assumptions about Japanese capabilities, as well as the belief that Pearl Harbor was too distant and too well defended to be vulnerable. Meanwhile, the Roosevelt administration continued to coordinate closely with Britain and other allied powers, sharing intelligence and aligning strategic objectives. These preparations reflected a growing understanding that global conflict was imminent and that the United States would soon be required to take a decisive stand. By late November 1941, diplomatic efforts with Japan had reached a breaking point. The United States presented a final proposal outlining conditions for peace, including Japan's withdrawal from China and Southeast Asia. Japanese leaders, unwilling to abandon their imperial ambitions, rejected the proposal. Unknown to American negotiators, Japan had already decided on war, setting in motion plans for a coordinated series of attacks across the Pacific. As Japanese naval forces moved into position, U.S. officials interpreted signs of possible aggression, but failed to pinpoint the exact location or timing. The stage was set for the dramatic confrontation that would change the course of world history. Roosevelt's administration continued to hope that firm diplomacy might avert war, but the momentum toward conflict had become unstoppable. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, brought months of rising tension to a sudden and catastrophic climax. Japanese aircraft inflicted devastating damage to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, destroying battleships, aircraft, and vital infrastructure. The attack shocked the American public and shattered any remaining divisions over intervention. Isolationist leaders immediately abandoned their opposition, recognizing that the United States had no choice but to respond. Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, calling the attack a date which will live in infamy, and asking for a declaration of war. His request was granted almost unanimously, marking America's official entry into World War II. The nation that had struggled for years to remain neutral now mobilized for total war, united by a sense of shared purpose and determination.